The rain came down hard that night, the kind that turned the dirt path into mud and made the barn roof sound like someone throwing gravel. Uldruk had already put out the lamp and was about to pull off his boots when he heard something outside the front door. Not a knock, more like a scratch. Small and slow, the way a branch drags across wood in the wind, except there was no branch near that door. He opened it anyway. 3 creatures sat on his porch in the rain. Each one was roughly the size of a large dog, though shaped like nothing a dog ever was. Long necks, folded wings pressed flat against their bodies, scales that caught the lamplight in dull colors, one reddish-brown, one dark grey, one the color of old ash. Their eyes were pale, not fully focused, the way newborn things look at the world before they have figured out what anything means. They were soaked through and shaking. Uldruk stared at them for a long moment. He was not a man who panicked easily. He had lived on this colony for 11 years, had fixed broken equipment in the middle of blizzards, had sat with his wife in her last weeks without falling apart. He knew how to look at a difficult thing without flinching. These were Drukhai young. He was almost certain of that, even though he had never seen one in person. The colony had information sheets about local wildlife, and the Drukhai were on them, listed under extreme caution, keep distance, do not engage. The adults were massive predators, intelligent, territorial, and completely uninterested in human settlements as long as humans stayed out of the deep forest. These were not adults. He looked at them. They looked back at him with those milky, unfocused eyes still shaking. He went inside, found a dry cloth, came back out and put it over the smallest one, the Ushgra one on the far left. It did not move away. It pressed into the cloth. That probably should have been enough. Cover them, wait until morning, contact the colony administrator, the sensible thing. Instead, he went to the kitchen, found the leftover meat from dinner, brought it out, and set it on the porch in front of them. The reddish-brown one moved first. It was the boldest, he would learn. It stretched its neck forward, sniffed the meat, then ate. The other 2 followed. He left the heat lamp on the porch. It was the small one he used in winter for seedlings. He aimed it at the space where they were huddled, went back inside, and told himself that was the end of it. In the morning, they were gone. That night they came back. They were waiting when he came home from the north field, sitting in a neat row beside the door the way they had been the night before. This time it was not raining. They just sat there, watching him walk up the path. He fed them again. He told his neighbor, a woman named Petra who ran the supply depot 2 plots over, and she looked at him the way people look at someone who has made a poor decision they cannot yet see the consequences of. Uldruk, she said, those are Drekai. Young ones, he said, very young. Their parents are out there somewhere. Maybe, he said, they keep coming back here though. Petra told the colony administrator, a broad-shouldered man named Rolf who had strong opinions about protocol and not much patience for exceptions. Rolf came to see Uldruk the next afternoon and told him clearly that feeding wild Drekai, even juveniles, was the kind of thing that ended badly. Adult Drekai were not aggressive by nature, but they were protective, and if a mother came looking for her young, a human farm was not where anyone wanted that encounter to happen. Uldruk heard this, he nodded, he said he understood. That evening, he put meat out on the porch. By the end of the 2nd week, he had given them names privately in his own head. The reddish-brown one was Rust. The dark grey one was Soot. The ash-pale smallest one was Flint. He did not call them these names out loud. They were just useful labels for keeping track of which one had eaten enough and which one seemed off. Flint seemed off on the 14th night, slower than usual, sitting with its wings pressed too tight. Uldruk crouched down and looked at it for a while. Then he went inside and came back with a warmer cloth and the small heating coil from the workshop shelf. He set it up close to where Flint was sitting and left it running through the night. In the morning, Flint was pressed up against the heating coil, asleep, and the other 2 were pressed against Flint. He stood there on the porch in the early cold, coffee in hand, looking at 3 baby Drukai piled against a piece of workshop equipment he now apparently could not have back. By the 3rd week, Rust had started following him to the barn. Not asking for anything, not being loud, just following the way something follows when it has decided that where you are is where it wants to be. Uldruk did not have the heart to stop it. He did not think much about what it meant. He was not a man who spent a lot of time on the meaning of things. Things happened, you responded, you kept going. That was the shape of his life, and it had served him well enough. What he did not know yet, what none of them knew, was that 3 small creatures choosing a human's threshold had already set something in motion that was far larger than any of them. Something that was even now turning its attention toward this quiet corner of a planet no one important had ever heard of. But that was still coming. For now there was just the barn, and Rust padding along behind him in the morning light, and work to do. The complaint was filed on a Tuesday. Uldruk did not find out until Thursday, when Rolf stopped by with a formal notice and the expression of a man who was uncomfortable but committed to his discomfort. The Galactic Settlement Authority had been notified. An investigator was being sent. Rolf was sorry, he said, but his hands were tied. Uldruk read the notice, folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket. He asked Rolf if he wanted coffee. Rolf said no. Uldruk made himself a cup anyway and went back out to check on the east fence, where one of the posts had been leaning since the last wind. The investigator arrived 6 days later. Her name was Yuna, and she was younger than Uldruk expected, compact, efficient-looking, with a dudapud that never seemed to leave her hand. She arrived with a vehicle, a GSA case number, and a Drukai. The Drukai was the one that stopped Uldruk mid-step when he came out of the barn to greet them. He had never seen an adult Drukai up close. This one was not enormous, not like what the colony files described the larger ones to be, but it was tall, lean, and covered in old scars that ran in pale lines across dark green scales. It watched Uldruk with yellow eyes that gave nothing away. Yuna introduced him as Drunuk, Cultural Liaison, GSA Xenobiology Division. Drunuk said nothing. He looked at the farm. He looked at the barn. His gaze moved slowly and deliberately, the way someone looks at a place when they are taking inventory of something they did not expect to find. Yuna was professional and thorough. She asked Uldruk how long the juveniles had been coming, what he had been feeding them, whether he had noticed any adult Drukai in the area, whether the Druklungs showed any signs of injury or distress. She took notes, recorded responses, photographed the porch and the heat lamp setup, and the small area near the barn door where Rust had worn a patch of ground smooth from sitting. Rust, Soot, and Flint were not there in the daytime. They came at dusk. Yuna said she would need to observe an evening visit. So they waited. Uldruk made dinner. Yuna accepted a plate which he had not expected. Drunuk stayed outside, walking the perimeter of the property with his hands at his sides. At dusk, as reliable as weather, 3 shapes came out of the tree line. They moved in single file, Rust first, then Soot, then Flint trailing slightly behind. They crossed the field, climbed the porch steps, and arranged themselves in their usual places. When they noticed Yuna, they paused. They looked at her for a moment. Then Rust looked at Uldruk, and when Uldruk did not react with alarm, the 3 of them settled down as if the stranger were not particularly significant. Yuna was writing very fast. Drunuk, who had come around the side of the house when the Druklungs appeared, stopped at the edge of the porch and went completely still. He stood there watching them with an expression that Uldruk could not read, but that felt, somehow, like a man who had just confirmed something terrible. Later, when the Druklungs had eaten and were drowsing in the warmth of the heat lamp, Drunuk asked to speak with Uldruk alone. They stood out in the yard in the dark, away from the porch. Drunuk's voice was low and careful. He asked about the sleeping arrangement. Did they sleep at the threshold of the house? Yes. Did they bring things? Uldruk mentioned Flint had dragged a large rock to the bottom of the porch steps 2 weeks ago and seemed satisfied about it. Drennick's jaw tightened. Did they move between Aldrich and strangers when strangers approached? Aldrich thought about it. He said yes, actually. When Rolf came with the formal notice, all three had placed themselves between Rolf and the door. He had thought it was just territoriality. Drennick said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you," in a tone that sounded like it cost him something to say, and walked back to the vehicle. That night Una filed her primary report. Standard language. No regulations broken. Juveniles appear healthy and self-selecting a human point of contact. Situation under observation. No recommended intervention at this time. Drennick filed a different report. Aldrich did not know about it. Una did not know about it. It was encrypted, sent through a channel that bypassed the standard GSA relay, and it was very short. It said, "The hatchlings are alive. They are healthy. They have taken a human guardian and the bonding behaviors are complete. They are on the agricultural colony designated Site 7 Ferris. The guardian's name is Aldrich." It said, "I am sorry to send this through a private channel. I did not know how else to reach you without causing what I am afraid this news will cause regardless." It said, "You should come yourself. I do not think anything else will be sufficient." He sent it to a recipient, whose name did not appear in any GSA contact directory. Then he sat in the vehicle in the dark, looked at the small warm light of the farmhouse porch, and waited for the reply that he knew without any doubt was coming. 3 months before Drennick's encrypted message was sent, a Dracari escort vessel called the Ironskill suffered a drive collapse in deep transit. The failure was fast, which was the only mercy in it. The crew had enough time to launch the emergency pods before the core went. They recovered most of the pods, most of the people. Most of what had been in the cargo bay, under heavy guard. 3 pods were not recovered. The official record listed them as lost to the transit collapse. In the deeper record, the one kept only by the Queen's own staff, they were listed differently. Not lost, unaccounted for. There was a difference. Lost meant gone, unaccounted for meant still looking. The Queen had been looking for 3 months. She had done it quietly, which required enormous effort for someone whose every movement was watched by 100 political eyes. A queen searching for something is a queen who is missing something, and a queen who is missing something is a queen with a weakness. Her rivals had been circling for years. She could not afford to show them what she was searching for. So she searched in silence, through trusted people, through channels that left no trace. Drennick was one of those people. She had sent him to the GSA post on that planet specifically because the drift calculations for the lost pods pointed to that system. It was a thin lead. She had been following thin leads for 3 months. His message arrived 6 minutes after he sent it. Her reply contained 2 words, "I am coming." The colony's astronomical monitoring station picked up the ship first, a vessel dropping out of transit far closer to the planet than any commercial ship was permitted. It was not a commercial ship. It was not a size that commercial ships came in. By the time the monitoring station relayed the alert to Rolf's office, the ship had already entered orbit and was not responding to standard hailing frequencies. It was responding to one frequency, the GSA Emergency Diplomatic Channel, which had not been used in 11 years. The voice on that channel identified the vessel as the embirdied flag vessel of the Dracari Royal Court and requested immediate communication with whoever was in charge of the agricultural colony on the surface. It was polite. It was also the kind of polite that left no space for the word no. Rolf's hands were shaking when he called Aldrich. Aldrich listened to what Rolf told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked Rolf to say the part about the Drakelings again, slowly. Rolf said it slowly. The 3 juveniles were not orphans. They were not stray wildlife. They were the Queen's youngest clutch, lost in a transport accident, officially listed as unrecoverable. The most powerful individual in the known galaxy had been looking for them for 3 months, and they had been sleeping on a human farmer's porch in the rain. Aldrich sat down on the nearest thing, which was a feed bucket. He stayed there for a bit. Then he got up, went inside, washed his hands, put on a cleaner shirt, and told Rolf he supposed someone should go talk to them. The advance party came down an hour later. 8 soldiers, armor that looked like it had been carved out of something dark and ancient, moving in a formation that took up most of the cleared space in front of the farm. Their leader was a tall Drakari with a deep scar running from his left eye ridge down to the corner of his jaw. He introduced himself as Sarath, Warden of the Royal Guard, and he delivered his opening statement in the tone of someone who had already decided how things were going to go. For the safety and security of the royal hatchlings, the human Aldrich was to be taken to the GSA outpost and held for formal questioning, while the hatchlings were secured and prepared for return to royal custody. Aldrich looked at Sarath. He looked at the 8 soldiers. He said calmly that he did not think that was going to work the way Sarath intended. Sarath told him it was not a request. And then the porch door swung open. Rust came out first, then Soot, then Flint, the smallest, last. They were bigger than they had been 2 months ago, growth was fast in the juvenile stage, and they moved without hesitation. They came down the porch steps and placed themselves in the space between Aldrich and the soldiers. 3 drakelings, juveniles, undersized and young and still with that slight unfocused cast to their pale eyes, standing in a line facing 8 armored adults. Zorath stopped. No one on his team moved. There was a long silence in which the wind moved through the grass and a distant bird called twice from the tree line and nothing else happened at all. Rust's tail was moving slowly, the way it did when Rust was paying close attention to something. Soot and Flint were still, heads low, watching. Sarath's expression was not one of anger. It was something harder to name. Something that might have been the look of a man who had just seen a door close on a plan he had been certain about. He did not give another order. He stood there, jaw set, and waited, because there was nothing else to do, because ordering his soldiers forward would mean going through 3 royal hatchlings, and that was not an order any sane Drakari would give. Not to hatchlings, not to the Queen's own children. The ship was still in orbit, the Queen was still coming. Everything else was just waiting for her to arrive. She did not send another advance party. She came herself, alone, in a smaller craft that landed in the cleared field with a sound like deep wind pressing against a mountain. Sarath's soldiers stood to attention. Drennick, who had stayed near the tree line since the standoff, moved closer. Yuna, who had driven back from the GSA outpost as fast as the vehicle would carry her when she heard what was happening, stood with her datapad frozen in her hand, not recording, not moving, just watching. The ramp lowered. Aldrich had expected something dramatic, a long wait, a formal announcement, some kind of ceremony. There was none of that. She simply walked down the ramp and the field felt smaller immediately, not because she was loud or fast, but because she was large in a way that was hard to prepare for even when you had been told. Her scales were black with a depth to them, the way still water is black, not flat but full of something underneath. Threads of dull gold ran from her shoulder ridges down along her sides. Her head was broader than a transit pod. She moved the way glaciers move in old footage. Slow, inevitable, like stopping had never been a concept that applied to her. The 3 drakelings went to her, without hesitation. Rust got there first, pressing its head against her leg with a force that would have knocked Aldrich sideways. Soot circled once, making a sound low in its throat, then pushed in beside Rust. Flint, always last, always the one that hung back slightly, walked to the Queen and stopped directly in front of her and looked up at her face. She lowered her head to each of them in turn. Long, slow, her eyes closing briefly when she reached Flint. She took her time. Nobody said anything. When she lifted her head again, she looked at Aldrich. He was standing where he had been standing when Sarath arrived, just in front of the porch steps. He had not moved backward during any of this, which was something several people present noticed later when they thought about it. She studied him. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was like being looked at from the inside out, from a direction you did not have a word for. He looked back at her steadily. She spoke. The translator on Drennick's equipment rendered it into flat, clean words with a slight delay. She asked, why did he care for them? Aldrich thought about the question seriously. He was not a man who gave quick answers when he did not have to. He said, they came to the door and they were small and it was cold and they were not eating. That was the kind of thing you answered when it knocked. The translator rendered this. The queen was quiet. She asked, when did he learn what they were? He said he had guessed by the 3rd week. He had looked at old reference images in the colony database. He was fairly sure before the end of the 1st month. She asked, and after he knew what changed. He thought about that. Then he said nothing changed. They were still cold at night. The food was not expensive. Another silence. Sareth, somewhere behind the queen and to the left, was rigid with something Aldrich could not quite interpret. Fury, possibly, or disbelief, or some combination that did not have a human name. The queen asked, what does he want, in return? Aldrich shook his head slightly. He said he did not want anything. He said, after a moment, that he would ask one thing, not a trade, just a question, which was whether they might be allowed to visit if they wanted to, after they went home. He understood if that was not possible. He just thought he should ask since they seemed to like the farm. The translator finished. The queen looked at Rust, who had settled beside Aldrich's left boot with the ease of long habit. She looked at this for several seconds. Then she lowered her head. Not fully, not to the ground. A partial inclination, deliberate and controlled, her eyes open, directed at Aldrich. It lasted 3 seconds. Then she straightened. Drennick made a sharp sound, not a word, just a sound, involuntary, and pressed his hand briefly over his own eyes. Una, who did not know what the gesture meant, would ask him about it later. He would tell her that the last time the queen had offered that acknowledgement to anyone, it had been to a Drakari general who had held a mountain pass for 9 days with a broken weapon to give the royal fleet time to evacuate an entire population center. He would tell her the gesture had a name in their language that translated roughly to, "You did right, and I saw it." What came next was formal and quick. Because the queen operated that way, decisions made, then recorded, then done. She declared, on record through Drennick's equipment which was transmitting to GSA channels, that the human Aldrich was to be designated Warden of Hatchlings under the royal accord of the Drakari brood line. The title had existed for over 4 centuries. It had never been given to anyone who was not Drakari. It meant, in practical terms, to harm this individual was to answer to the queen, directly, with no intermediary and no appeal. Sareth said nothing. His stillness was the kind that took effort. Aldrich asked what the designation required of him, day to day. Drennick, translating, said, nothing. It required nothing. It was not a duty. It was a recognition. Aldrich nodded. He looked at Rust sitting by his boot. He looked up at the queen. He said he still had to fix the north field irrigation before the cold set in. He hoped that was all right. Drennick translated this. The queen made a sound. It took Una 3 months of studying the recording to conclude that the sound was, in fact, laughter. The announcement went out through official GSA channels at 3 in the afternoon, colony time. By midnight it had reached every major relay station in the settled galaxy. By the following morning, 17 different governing bodies had called emergency sessions. Nobody had expected this. That was not entirely true. Nobody in power had expected this. Drennick had expected something like it. Una had begun to suspect something was coming when she saw the queen's gesture and watched Drennick's reaction. But the rest of the galaxy, the councils and committees and diplomatic offices and trade organizations that spent enormous energy tracking everything the Drakari did, had not expected this at all. The Drakari did not do this. The Drakari did not form attachments with other species. They did not extend royal accord protections outside their own bloodline. They had, as a civilization, maintained a policy of non-entanglement for 300 years that was so consistent it had stopped being a policy and become simply a fact of the universe, like the speed of light or the coldness of deep space. And now they had tied their accord, their highest formal protection, to a human farmer on a colony that most political databases had filed under low priority, unstrategic, no known resources. The implications took about 6 hours to fully unfold in the political consciousness of the settled galaxy. If the Dracari would make that gesture for one human, what did that say about how they regarded humans in general? If they had allowed 3 of their own royal children to bond with a human, and had responded not with fury but with formal recognition, what did that say about where humanity sat in their estimation? And if a species that nobody allied with, nobody pressed, and nobody threatened had just quietly placed one human under the same protection that covered their own queen's household? What did that say to every faction that had been slowly, carefully, making life difficult for human expansion across the frontier? It said, reconsider. It did not say it loudly. The Queen made no speech. The Dracari sent no warnings. They simply recorded the designation, transmitted it through proper channels, and went home. The silence was the message. Everyone who mattered understood the silence. 3 separate councils that had been working on trade restriction proposals against human colonies quietly shelved the proposals. One planetary federation that had denied a human colony's application for transit rights approved it 6 days later with no comment. A border dispute that had been grinding along for 2 years, in which human colonists had been losing ground slowly and steadily, found the other side suddenly willing to negotiate. None of these parties announced any connection to what had happened on a small farm on an unimportant planet. They did not need to. The shape of it was plain enough to anyone paying attention. At the colony itself, things were different in smaller, more immediate ways. The GSA upgraded Site 7 Ferris from low priority to monitored status, which meant better supply routes and a faster response guarantee on infrastructure requests. Rolf quietly applied for the irrigation grant that he had been told 3 years running was not available for colonies at their priority level. It was approved in 11 days. Petra, who ran the supply depot, started getting orders from off-world buyers who had apparently decided that anything produced near the farm of the human the Dracari Queen had acknowledged was worth paying premium prices for. She did not understand it. She accepted it. Aldrich received 412 individual messages in the first week. He read none of them. Una, who had stayed at the colony to complete her report, helped him set up a filter. He thanked her and went back to work. 2 governments offered him full citizenship and relocation packages. One offered a substantial financial settlement for the rights to document his story. A university on a well-funded core world requested permission to send a research team. A children's educational channel requested an interview. He declined everything through Una, who had unofficially become his communications manager, partly because she was already there and partly because she had the kind of personality that enjoyed writing firm but polite rejections. 3 weeks after the Queen's departure, Sareth came back. No ship this time, no soldiers, just Sareth alone in a small transit vehicle landing in the field without notice. Aldrich saw him from the barn and walked over. Sareth stood with his arms at his sides. He looked like a man who had rehearsed something and was now uncertain whether to say it. He asked Aldrich after a silence what humans were, not politically. He said specifically, not politically. He wanted to know what Aldrich thought they were at the base of it. Aldrich leaned against the fence post and thought about it. He said, people who answer the door. That was the best he could put it. Something knocks, something needs something, you answer. He did not think he had done anything extraordinary. He thought most people, given the same situation, would do the same. Sareth was quiet for long enough that Aldrich wondered if the translator had failed. Then Sareth said, most species would not have done the same. Most individuals would not have done the same. He had spent his life around the Queen, protecting things that were valuable and rare, and he had developed a reliable sense for what was dangerous. He had been wrong about Aldrich. He said this as a statement of fact with no apology attached to it, which was, Aldrich sensed, the Dracari version of an apology. Then Sareth nodded once, got back in his vehicle and left. Aldrich watched him go, then went back into the barn. The Drakelings had been gone for 3 weeks, back to wherever royal children lived when they were not on a farmer's porch. That evening, just before dark, 3 shapes came out of the tree line. They were bigger. Noticeable difference in 3 weeks, the way young things grow. But they crossed the field the same way they always had: Rust first, Soot second, Flint last, and climbed the porch steps and sat in their usual places. Aldrich turned the heat lamp on. He went inside to get the food. Some things, he thought, did not require a lot of thinking about. A year went by the way years do on a farm, in work, in weather, in small repairs and seasonal rhythms that did not care much about history being made. The Northfield irrigation got fixed in late autumn, 2 weeks before the first frost. Aldrich did the job himself with some help from Petra's son, who was 17 and strong and willing to carry pipe sections without being asked twice. The yield the following spring was the best Aldrich had seen in 4 years. He wrote this in the farm log without comment. The Drakelings came back 4 times that first month, then 3 times the next month. Then they settled into a pattern, irregular but consistent, the way rivers are. Sometimes once a week, sometimes twice, sometimes a gap of 10 days and then 2 nights in a row. Aldrich stopped trying to predict it and just left the heat lamp on. They were growing fast. By the 6-month mark, Rust could not fit through the barn door without turning sideways. By the 8-month mark, Soot's wingspan, when it stretched on the porch, reached the far railing. Flint was still the smallest, still the last one out of the tree line every time, but the milky cast was gone from its eyes now. They were sharp and amber and very alert. What they did on the farm changed as they grew. In the early months they had been curious about everything, knocking things over, investigating tools, attempting to eat objects that were not food. As they got bigger they became, in their unpredictable way, useful. Rust discovered that it could move the large feed bales that Aldrich needed the equipment for, and began doing this without being asked whenever it noticed them sitting in the wrong place. Soot developed an interest in the livestock that was alarming at first, but turned out to be pure herding instinct. It would circle the perimeter of whatever field the animals were in with a focused, satisfied air that the animals themselves eventually stopped being terrified by. Flint mostly watched. Occasionally, when Aldrich was working on something mechanical and needed an extra set of something to hold a component in place, Flint would come close and hold it, patient and still, for as long as was needed. Aldrich did not make a big thing of any of this. It was what it was. Una's report, when it was published in full, ran to over 300 pages and was immediately cited by 12 separate research institutions. She sent Aldrich a copy. He put it on the shelf where he kept the colony's equipment manuals and did not read it, though he did look at his name in the index once briefly, and then closed it. She had titled her paper, in the dry language of GSA academic work, something about non-standard cross-species bonding behaviors in Dracari juveniles, and the role of consistent environmental safety in attachment formation. What the paper was actually about, as every person who read it understood immediately, was what had happened on this farm and why, and what it meant that a species no one had ever gotten close to had looked at a human being doing an ordinary thing and decided, on their own and without negotiation, that they trusted it. Drennick sent a personal message in the spring which was unusual. Not official, no GSA headers, just text through a general relay. It said the Queen had asked about the farm specifically, had asked how the Northfield had come out. He wrote this as if passing along mild news. Aldrich wrote back that the yield was good. He asked how the hatchlings were doing in court. Drennick's reply took a week. He said the royal tutors were struggling. He said the three of them had apparently decided that several Dracari formal protocols were optional, and that certain sections of the palace were better used for running than for ceremony. He said the queen had been observed watching them with an expression that the court had never seen on her face before and could not fully name, but which seemed to involve something like satisfaction. Aldrich read this and smiled at the wall for a moment. Then he folded the message and put it in the farm log, between the autumn yield records and the spring planting schedule. He did not think about legacy. He was not built for thinking about legacy. What he thought about was the fence on the south side that needed reinforcing before rust leaned on it again, and the grain storage unit that had been making a sound it shouldn't be making since March, and whether the weather would hold long enough to get the east field turned over before the next rain came in. That was the shape of his days. Work, weather, the small decisions that added up to a life. On a night in late spring, warm enough that he left the porch door open, Aldrich sat outside after dinner with a cup of something and looked at the sky. The colony was quiet. The lights were on in Petra's depot, 2 plots over, and there was a distant sound of something mechanical from the direction of the road, but otherwise it was just the field and the tree line and the dark above. 3 shapes came out of the trees. They were larger every time now, Rust especially, who moved with the beginning of that adult heaviness, that sense of weight and density. But they still came in the same order they always had, still crossed the field the same way, still climbed the porch steps and settled in their usual places, Flint pressing close to the edge of the heat lamp's warmth. Aldrich looked at them for a while. He thought about Sareth's question, what are humans at the base of it? He did not have a better answer now than the one he had given then. They answer the door. They leave the light on. When something small and cold shows up, they get the food, they get the lamp, they make a space. It was not heroic. It was not special. It was just the thing you did when the thing needed doing. He finished his drink. He went inside. The door stayed unlocked. The heat lamp stayed on. In the morning, all 3 of them were still there, and Aldrich made enough breakfast for everyone, the way he always did now, without thinking about it much at all. That was enough. That had always been enough.